Welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Lana Sherman, and I am a member of the board. The Network for Responsible Public Policy brings timely, fact-based programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement. Tonight's program will explore corruption and power at the top. Our moderator is Roger Berkowitz, a founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities. He's a professor of politics, philosophy, and human rights at Bard College. Tonight, Roger is joined by Zephyr Teachout, a professor of law at Fordham Law School. She focuses on the intersection of corporate power and political power. Her subjects include corporations, election law, antitrust, and prosecuting white-collar crime. Please visit our website to read Roger and Zephyr's extensive bios. As always, we will take audience questions. Please type your question into the Q&A box. We'll answer as many as we can. A video of tonight's program will be available in the coming days on our website and our YouTube channel. Welcome to NFRPP. Roger, I'll turn the program over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Lana. And it's a pleasure to be here back at the network. And it's something I've spoken at many times and always a pleasure to be here. So thank you. Um, yeah, I'm thrilled to be here as moderator talking with Zephyr Teachout, who, whoops, is it not working? Uh, Thrilled to be here with Zephyr Teachout, who is not only an old friend, but one of the most, I think, important and profound thinkers about our democracy and the problem of corruption in our democracy. I should just note that she, amongst many things that she's written, has written a great book called Corruption in America: From Benjamin Franklin's Snuff Box to Citizens United, which I highly recommend people to check out. Zephyr, it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's really great to be here, and thank you so much for providing this forum, which, as I think we'll eventually talk about, is one of the most important things we can be doing, is coming together and asking what we should do. And
Exactly.
especially with Roger, from whom I have a nighttime
We got a guest.
visitor. I have a guest.
Hey, Dashel.
Anyway,
I,
okay, yes. So
yeah,
anyway, thanks for talking. And Roger and I chatted briefly beforehand, and with your indulgence, what I think I'd like to do is start out very far away from the current moment. We can note the scandals that are happening. In fact, we live sort of, sorry, just a sec. Hey, Nick.
Yep. Buddy, story time.
See you, kiddo.
Story time.
Story time for all of us. I'm going to do a constitutional convention story time, and my son is going to learn something else. But we live so intensely in the present right now, and we can talk about some of the elements of the present, but there's, I think, a real value in going to other crisis points, where people were really focused on questions of corruption and rehearse and engage the kinds of questions they were engaged in. So I really want to spend some time at the Constitutional Convention, the 1787 Constitutional Convention, not because I am one of those who adulates the Constitution above all or thinks it is the most perfect example of government that has ever existed, although I think there's some wonderful things that came out of it, but because I want to really be in conversation with a time at which people thinking about government were putting questions of corruption very much front and center. So at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the concern of corruption was almost like a daily haunting. Corruption or corrupt, the language was invoked more often than, say, the fear of violence or the fear of faction, which is something that we famously hear really concerned the founders. And the way in which they talked about corruption, I think is really important. They talked about corruption not in terms of a narrow sense of positive law violations, of breaking anti-corruption rules, laws, or norms, but rather in terms of how to shape institutions that wouldn't lead to corruption. So I'll start with a story which is, I think, very much very contemporary as we see Donald Trump accepting luxury gifts from foreign governments. The story of the emoluments clause of the Constitution, and I'm going to broaden out to some other examples. There's Silas Deane after the Articles of Confederation. He's a struggling diplomat. He leaves France after his time in France, and he has a little jeweled snuff box from Louis XVI. And instead of this being a small moment, this becomes a national scandal. His enemies say, you have betrayed the revolution. You've broken the Articles of Confederation by accepting this gift. But he's not the only one to accept a gift. Arthur Lee gets his own little jeweled box. John Jay gets a horse from Spain. And then most notoriously, Benjamin Franklin himself, in his many lives, his second to last life as a diplomat, gets a portrait jeweled snuff box. And this leads to a major debate. Because at the time, this kind of gift to foreign diplomats was seen as wholly routine and actively positive, that the gift giving between, say, a king and a visiting diplomat strengthened the bonds of friendship, of affection, of warmth, of good feeling between different countries. And so the idea that there would be a scandal wasn't just obvious, but actually was strange for some, saying this is the defenders of Deane and Franklin and others said, if we actually break this custom, we're going to break the ties between nations that bring us together and allow for international peace. But the young Americans, and I say young partly because many of the people at the convention were young and partly because of the newness of the Articles of Confederation, were quite strident about the belief that this thing that looked like it was enabling friendship could actually lead to something quite dark, the corruption of this young country by foreign governments using gifts and even using those sort of sinews of affection and friendship that come along with gifts to then influence the American government. And so they included in the Constitution this clause that forbids the taking of any kind of gift whatsoever from a foreign king or prince. Now, before we hold anybody up as saying that they were saintly, and by the way, in Europe, this provision was mocked. The one other country that had it, interestingly, was the Dutch, the center of global trade. They're very concerned about foreign influence or global trade. And Grotius remarked that, who do the Dutch think they are? Like trying to emulate the Republic of Plato in the fens and marshes. They're too high-minded for the realness of politics. Jefferson, who supported this, then later actually gets a jeweled box and hides it, removing the diamonds and smuggling them so he can sell them. So representing this sort of, Jefferson continuously representing these core contradictions in the American experiment. And so when we think about, what Trump is doing now, violating the emoluments clause, and as somebody who sued Donald Trump in his first administration and have looked closely at his current actions and think he's currently violating the emoluments clause, I think we sometimes have a tendency to think about it in purely legal terms, like violating a law. But it's important to actually investigate what are the underlying purposes of these laws. So what led to the founders being so focused on corruption? I mean, there's lots of different stories. I'm not going to get all into all of them. One is that Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is kind of being released in serial at this time and read and remarked on and annotated by the framers, who are then thinking about creating something new. We'll return to this as what we can do, because I do think we are in a moment where we have a deeply problematic government, and so it's important to think about creating something new. But in those moments of creation, they were looking at other moments of decay to say, what can we learn from those moments of decay? And what they came to learn was that I'm going to forget which framer said this. It's the fate, corruption is the fate of all republics. Or George Mason said, that if we do not protect against corruption, we are at an end. They saw corruption, which comes from the Latin rupt, to break, rupt, to break from the inside, as the most essential threat to a free republic. The thing against which we must be most vigilant, even more so than external violence. And what they saw when they were reading Gibbon was that decline came from elites who sold loyalty for power. They also were drawing on their own experience of Britain, which so many of them admired as a model constitution, but then saw as a model constitutional system that had been corrupted. So they're really obsessed because they see something, the finest fabric which history has ever reared, as one said, being then degraded by corruption, by placemen, people going into politics to get basically a good salary, by the king corrupting the parliamentarians. And there's a fascinating later colloquy, which Jefferson recounts, between Adams and Hamilton, talking about England, in which Adams says, I think reflecting what most of the framers thought at the time, England, if you just take out the corruption, it would be extraordinary. And what Hamilton replied, Hamilton, who famously loved centralized power, or perhaps no famously for people like me, one of the sort of key features of Hamilton is his love of centralization and power. Hamilton said, if you take out the corruption, it will fall apart. Hamilton actually saw the king's ability to achieve loyalty through favors as essential to effective government, and was somewhat besotted by the centralization in the British model as opposed to concerned about it. They were also inspired by Montesquieu, who saw corruption as a real degradation, and Locke and Pufendorf and others. They're really steeped in thinking about what corruption is and how to protect against it. And then, of course, and I mentioned Locke in passing, but we'll probably talk less about this, but of course, they also are thinking about corruption in both a Christian tradition, corruption as a form of sin. And I write about this a little less, but I think it's really important to understanding their context. And then they're also thinking about it through the lens of the risk of corruption that we don't talk about very much now, but the risk of luxury is corrupting the person. That sort of softening the willpower and softening virtue. And when they're talking about corruption, I'm going to use a kind of a shorthand, but I think it's important. I see them, and I'd love to hear Roger's thoughts on this as well, as really being in the Aristotelian Montesquieu virtue tradition. Aristotle describes the three forms of government: the ideal forms and the corrupted forms. For Aristotle, the ideal form of the government of the one is, and this is in translation, the monarch, and the corrupted form is the tyrant. And he says the difference between the monarch and the tyrant is not the structure of power, both have one ruler. It's that the monarch seeks the public good and the tyrant seeks his own interests. The difference then, the next form of government, the rule of the few, is the aristocracy versus the oligarchy. So that he sees the aristocracy as a small group a few who govern all, and the oligarchs as a small group, a few who govern all. And the thing that distinguishes them, again, is not the structure of power, but whether they are seeking the public good or their own selfish ends. And finally, there's the rule of the public or the mob. And the positive vision is the public that is seeking the public good, and the negative vision, which he calls democracy, is the public. But that's not, the term means different things now. It doesn't have the same necessary inflection that he saw it as, but as the masses who are only engaged in the public for their own ends, for selfish ends. And the reason I think it's important to raise this is because for many, many years, really since the 60s, I'd say, a lot of leading corruption scholars, thinkers, wanted to kind of avoid this question of public good or virtue or seeking your own end and think about corruption more as law breaking, violating particular bribery rules, kickbacks, but not this fundamental Aristotelian way of thinking about it as being, what is the spirit with which you approach your job in public life, your job as a citizen or your job as a governor? And with this, in the last few years, real increased focus on the problem of corruption, I believe it's important to take very seriously this 2,000-year tradition of understanding that it is not just these technical violations, but a spirit with which one approaches the job of government. So with this background, and I'll wrap up soon because there's I want to move more into a discussion. We can talk about more examples. There's this background, and the convention happens. George Washington, only time he speaks at the convention is to protect against corruption. And he wants to have a large House of Representatives because a small body would be too easy to buy. And Benjamin Franklin is so focused on this. By this time, he's really frail. He has to be carried in on a chair to the convention. And he actually cares so much about the concerns about corruption that he has written out his remarks and has a younger delegate read them out. And he wants to have public officers be unpaid altogether. So it's a perhaps absurd spectacle now, but he was so haunted by what he saw in Britain, which is people going into public life to make money, that he wanted to wholly sever the tie between public life and making money. And I think sort of understanding his focus there is important. In fact, neither Washington nor Franklin got what they desired. But instead, you see debates about corruption in the discussion of how often should we have elections? What are the residency rules? We don't want outsiders buying seats. The census was designed to prevent corruption in the borough system. Appropriations, transparency, the takings clause, and even the treaty clause, all of which, when you look at the actual debate, they were saying, how do we organize this in a way so that the governors will not be corrupted, by which they meant in an Aristotelian Montesquieu sense, so that the people in public power would seek the public good as opposed to seek their own self-interest. And they're not totally naive. They know that people are a blend of self-interest and public interests, but they were interested in creating structures that made the public interest the most central. So I have a lot else to say. I want to just tell one quick, two tiny stories, and then we'll move on. This question of the threat of corruption, the specter of corruption is the biggest threat, stays for a long time in American history and stays as a serious puzzle. One of the first Supreme Court puzzles was, what do you do when an entire legislature has been bribed and a law was passed entirely through bribery? These are kinds of questions that feel alive today. Like, how do you think about law if you see the structure of law having been created in an entirely corrupt system? And in that case, it's called the Yazoo land scandal that gripped the country for decades. The Supreme Court said the law was passed. The fact that it was passed through corrupt means is not something we can judge. Another thing that really developed after, much more after after industrialization, was the rise of lobbying. And now we take for granted that lobbying is protected by the U.S. First Amendment. But the big lobbying case that made it to the Supreme Court in the 1880s, there's an old man who'd hired a lobbyist. Lobbyist did the job for him. The old man then refused to pay the lobbyist. And he said, I'm not going to pay you. You're a corrupt lobbyist. This contract should not be honored by our courts because it is a corrupt contract. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yes, although this particular lobbying incident may have been well-meaning, if ever the great corporations of our day were to use these means, in other words, lobbying, we would see that it would corrupt all government. So you see the court there struggling with tensions between speech rights and visions of corruption, and coming out saying the concern with corruption was greater than the individual speech rights. I think I'm going to stop there just as a foray. We're stopping in the 1880s, but with a provocation to engage in this kind of thinking as we face, I think, very significant threats of corruption, many of which were talked about the framing, particular the question of a powerful executive.
Thank you so much, Zephyr. Zephyr first, I think it was almost 15 years ago or something that I first heard Zephyr give a speech about this topic, and I was really enraptured by it, and I had not known this history of the convention that at the convention, the concern with corruption was even more palpable, the concern with faction, with the fact that there were factions that would disagree, and how can you have a government that balances factions? That was obviously one of the key concerns of the convention. And as someone who very much is in the tradition of what in political science is called civic republicanism of some sort, the belief that a republic, and America was not a democracy, right? It was a republican form of government. That's what's guaranteed in the Constitution. A res publica, which in Latin means the public thing. The framers really did believe that if you didn't have the virtue that led us to put the public interest above our private interests, the Republican self-government experiment would fail. And so their worry was, above all, to ward off the corruption that would undermine the public spiritedness of citizens. And I've found Zephyr's unpacking of this and moral articulation of it incredibly convincing and provocative. She and I have been talking about this over the last few months, and I think what's interesting is that in the last year, as I've tried to come to grip with what's going on in the country and the world, I've started to at least see my view on this has, I won't say changed, but has become more nuanced. And I want to push Zephyr on this in this way. Now, one of the examples I'm going to give, I think I've mentioned to you before in a private conversation, but I'm going to turn it, I think, in a slightly different way, and I want to hear your response to it. So, let's say that you've identified two different forms of corruption, if I can say so. One is gifts, right? A snuff box, diamonds, things like that, which are sort of like a kind of bribe, or some sort of sense of undermining your independence. The other is selling loyalty for power. Now, they can go together, right? You can give gifts as a way of buying loyalty.
Right.
But there's a way in which giving gifts is not buying loyalty, right?
Right.
And I think I told you this. I told you this story a couple months ago, but you may not remember. But when I was a young lad, my dad used to take me to baseball games, um and we were fans of a team, the New York Mets, that was not very good at the time, and the stands were often quite empty. And my dad would buy us tickets up in the second or third deck, and we would go down to the field level in the nicest seats, and he'd go up to an usher and give him a certain amount of money. I don't know what it was. I was young. And the usher would say, "Thank you very much," and take us to the seats and clean off the seats and put us down and take care of us for the rest of the game. This is clearly an example of corruption, right? It's you're stealing money from the owners of the team, and you're giving it, you're bribing some guy to let you break the rules. And yet, I thought it was awesome. And there's a certain kind of, um, if I can say it, manly respect that one gets for doing this. And and I saw it as a great thing that my dad had the power to corrupt some young usher or some old usher or whatever it was. And so, I think that there's something about corruption which we have to understand, as about creating, um, that rules are there, but rules are made to be broken, and that we have to know when to break the rules and when not to break the rules, and maybe we should worry about gifts, but gifts on their own are not the problem, right? Um, it's when the gifts come with expectations or other things. Now, one can say, well, all gifts are preparation for and buying loyalty or things like that. So one question is, are all emoluments bad? Or all, is it, isn't there something nice about Qatar being able to give the president a $500 million jet as a gesture of friendship? Um, uh, Joking slightly, but
No,
the
no.
second part really comes from something you said just now in your remarks, which is that um, there really is a difference between what we call Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians on this.
Yeah.
And whereas you and I are somewhat Jeffersonians, who are Republican, small r Republican, thinkers of virtue. When you said that Hamilton said that the king's ability to achieve loyalty through favors is essential, I think that this really does fit into another side of America, right? America is not only Republican, it's also about getting things done, and there's this Hamiltonian aspect to it. And all of this, is to say that um uh you know we have to understand that one of the reasons so many people like Donald Trump
Yeah.
is because he's out there and honest about his corruption, right? There is a strong sense that everybody's corrupt, but they are hypocrites. And 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 they're hypocrites and we don't like hypocrites. And B, insofar as they're corrupt, but they're stealthy about it, they're helping themselves. Whereas Trump is being honest about it. Yeah, he's helping himself, but he's asserting American power, asserting American dominance. And if we're all, as long as we're all going to be corrupt and all the countries are corrupt, it's better to actually sit there and show your power and reap the benefits of it. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering, if there's any nuance in your reading to corruption, or if I'm just, nostalgic from my father's corruption.
No, I don't want to throw my father under the bus, but I think it was my father. If not, it was a dear friend who said just little law breaking now and then, just for your self-respect. Never hurt anybody. So, um, but you raise so many wonderful, complex issues, and I want to address what I see as a few of them in turn. One has to do with the role of gifts. And one has to do with the role of centralized power, and the third has to do with, I think, this sort of understanding of this moment. And I think one and three go together, and then I want to talk about centralized power. They all go together. But on gifts, um, uh, yeah, I started my book with that, and I certainly had a more puritanical approach, I think, when I wrote the book than I do now. That doesn't mean that I don't think that I think the clause is important. So I want to separate those two out, right?
You just Not everyone may know what the emoluments
Oh
clause
yeah,
is.
sorry.
I realize that we've been talking about it. Can you just remind people what that
Yeah,
is?
there's two emoluments clause, but I'm talking about the foreign emoluments clause that forbids uh, officials, federal officials, from taking any gift or title of nobility of any kind whatsoever from a foreign prince or head of state. So its easiest form typically is, say, a member of the military can't take $100 or $1,000 cash, payment. There is a without consent of Congress, and so this is actually a little important because Congress can step in and has in fact stepped in to give consent. And the way it's stepped in is by having a de minimis rule that you can take uh, trophies, cookies, wine, up to a couple $100 worth, and nice decorations, just not multi-million-dollar or $100,000 gifts. Um, the reason the Dutch were so focused on it is because they were worried about trade officers. So when you think we think about it now in terms of the presidency, but they're focused on somebody checking your tariffs in 1670, getting slipped some cash to lighten the tax load on some imports, right? So they just had a lot of pressure on their local officers. So I think one of the questions in the background here is who is in what role in relationship to gifts? And when it comes to judges, we have a long tradition of being really, really strict about not accepting gifts. In fact, the first anti-bribery law, bribe comes from the French, to eat, to devour, right? Said that you hang a judge if they take anything to eat or drink from any of the litigants. So it's not in a democratic context, it's in a judicial context. And the rule against judges accepting gifts is not, I'm just repeating myself, but it's not essentially related to democratic questions. It comes from plenty of monarchic traditions too, right? That judges in the litigant context shouldn't be influenced to have interest or bonds with the lawyers and the plaintiffs in front of them. That's the tradition. And then on the other hand, you have a totally different tradition, which is, I think, part of what Roger's calling on, which is that gifts are an essential way to build bonds of friendship and care and connection and community. And the democratic tradition of feasts on election day and making offers to people, making promises to people that you want to vote for you. These require a ton of interchange, right? And gifts going back and forth. And right now, campaign finance gifts going back and forth. There's a lot of interchange in one arena. There's kind of a non-interchange in another arena. And the question is, where do federal officers fit? Are they like judges? Are they like politicians? Where should they fit? And so I actually think that there is a fair amount of room for nuance in moral judgment about gifts. And yet it's one of the Supreme Court's, I think, greater failings is to undermine rules against gift giving to agency heads, which they did in the 1980s, saying effectively a little bit of not what Roger's saying, but something related, which is that's just politics. Like, of course, agency heads get taken. And the exact example, which I love your example, Roger, was getting taken to baseball games. Right? So you get front row seats at a baseball game. That's just a gift. There was no evidence of quid pro quo. The California farmers who took the agency head in that the case to a baseball game weren't asking for anything in particular. The Supreme Court says that's normal politics and should not be condemned by federal anti-corruption law. I think the court was wrong there, not because there can't be a lot of innocent instances of it, but precisely because it is difficult to separate the corrupt instances from the uncorrupt instances. Like, how do you look into somebody's soul? It's helpful to have pretty clear rules that say nothing more than $100. That doesn't mean you're evil if you take a $300 fruit plate. It just means that these are rules of the road. But I actually share your. I am currently less focused on gifts and more focused on power, right? So to me, the emoluments clause is not the essential anti-corruption clause in the Constitution. It's one of the more explicit ones. But the existence of democratic elections, the we the people, the right to a Republican government, clauses which are ignored all the time by the Supreme Court, but I actually think are very, very meaningful clauses that establish that we have a political community with rights and obligations. Those are the important ones. And then the limits on executive power. And we have, I think we're really reaping among many other things, in terms of reaping what we sowed, a consistent move towards stronger and stronger centralized power, federally centralized power, and executive power. Both have led to the more foundational corruption in our system, far more than the handful of gifts. And we kind of cry out for these Trump moments because we're looking for a symbol as big as the corruption that we feel in the system. And I'm laughing, but it's not funny. But and he shouldn't do them. I think they're real clear violations. But we also grab onto them because it's hard to express the sort of deeper rot that I think goes throughout the whole system. A second thing then that you talked about was, why people, this relates to gifts. For people who are poor and working class, the idea that you would ban gifts is crazy. Right? That it's actually so, there is a way in which the sort of Puritan call to ban gifts feels like a class-based model. And so when you have a legalistic approach towards anti-corruption, which is you violated the law, I caught you. You violated the rule, I caught you. For a lot of people, that doesn't, I think, and I just think you expressed this well, this doesn't really read as what the essential corruption is. What they are witnessing is 40 years of increased concentration of wealth and power, despite all kinds of rhetoric. They're witnessing over half of all Congress members, I don't even know where it is now, whether it's 60%, go into lobbying. Even if you don't think lobbying should be illegal, that's disgusting. It feels like it's a direct taking my vote and turning it into your cash for your third home. And so the idea that law and corruption are aligned, I think for most people that thread has been broken long ago. So to your point about Donald Trump and claims of corruption, there is both a widespread sense that the system is corrupt. And I think a lot of people who are not interested in condemning Trump in particular, unless you're willing to condemn the whole regime, because it just doesn't seem credible to say, well, he took this, but meanwhile, most lawmakers are getting wealthy off of land deals, and they're saying it's all legal, it's all approved, so it's all okay.
Can I ask a question
Yeah,
here? I
yeah,
mean, because it does strike me that I was on the radio yesterday talking about Federalist 51, which of course we all know what that says, but it was written by Madison. And in my reading of the Federalist Papers and the Constitution, it's one of the most important Federalist Papers because it's where Madison says that the separation of powers only works when the each branch is ambitious for its power and is jealous of its own power. The
yeah,
Congress has to be jealous of its power. The president has to be jealous of its power. The court and the judiciary has to be jealous of its power. And the main problem in our politics in the last 70 years has not been that the president has taken more and more power, which they have. It's that the Congress has not been jealous or ambitious for its power. And
yeah,
our friend, I think you must have known him. I don't know, maybe not. No, you probably Ted Lowy, right, who used to teach at Cornell,
yeah.
wrote the great book, The End of Liberalism, in
Mhm.
which he basically made the argument that the great problem and the end of liberalism in America is that all the incentives for Congress to try and govern have disappeared. They want to raise money. They want to have their careers. What they have to do is not rock the boat. And so they pass the power to the executive and to administrative agencies and the president. And and so I think what I hear you saying is, yeah, the system is so corrupt. People don't really care about the legalities of it. They see the whole system as corrupt. And what they sort of like about Trump is, we need somebody to say the buck stops here. And there's something, again, we may hate Trump, we
Yeah,
may hate him as a person or what he's doing, but what's interesting and what's been so, what you and I have been talking about over the last 6 months is everyone knows Trump is fundamentally corrupt and it doesn't seem to care. And I
yeah,
think the reason is because no one else is willing to govern. And
yeah,
so he's coming out and saying, look, I'm going to be corrupt. I'm going to be ambitious for power for the executive, but I'll get things done and I'll govern.
yeah.
I don't
And
know.
we're moving. I mean, it's so my only asterisk there is a lot of people don't like Trump, but they don't like anybody else either. They certainly don't like Democrats right now, right? Democrats are, and I think this. I was talking to a friend recently about how much Americans love action, and I am very American in this way too. There is energetic attraction to action itself, to the stream getting released, to energy and power being exercised sort of on its own. That's one of the American strains. We're talking about one anti-corruption strain for this other strain. And so when you say right, that there is a lot of his polling numbers are still underwater. That's my only asterisk. But the power, what seems like it should be sort of a clear cudgel, like, look at his corruption, he's stealing from you, doesn't have the power because I'll put it a different way. It doesn't have the power when it's wielded by leading Senate Democrats, because people look at leading Senate Democrats and they see both an apology for corruption. Like, let's look at Menendez, recently sentenced. More importantly, it wasn't like Democrats were calling for his ouster 10 years ago when it was clear that he was already set. They were willing to protect corruption within their own ranks. So they've lost a lot of credibility there. And then lots of words and no action. So to your point, so it's a combination of everybody's sort of in on this grift. They all seem to have second homes. Why is his eighth home more of a concern than their second home?
So there's a question from Nancy R, which she may have left already. in a huff, but I just wanted to put it out there. She says, if I would have known you all speak so favorably regarding Trump's corruption, I would never have attended. Have we been
Oh,
speaking favorably of Trump's corruption? Do you think?
no, we're not. Yeah, I think this is really important because I think Trump, when I think of corruption, I describe it as the essential corruption as using all the power that he has for selfish ends.
Yeah.
So it is corrupt both in the legal sense and in the every historical sense of antiquity. I think Trump is profoundly dangerous. The reason I'm talking about this stuff is because if we don't try to understand why others don't share our views about Trump's danger, then I think we're falling into the trap of his first term. So, and that's very personal to me as somebody who went all around the country talking about Trump's corruption in his first term and really believed that, well, yes, he's underwater, polling wise, and seems like people don't like his corruption, that we could use that as a cudgel. And I think it takes some real introspection if we are going to achieve a democratic, self-governing society to recognize how we got here and how we don't just recreate it. So I'm sorry, Nancy, and I appreciate how this could come across as defending him, but I'm truly not.
Yeah.
I'm truly not.
There's a
Yeah.
couple of questions that I think I want to move towards because there's a lot of questions here. One is about the Supreme Court, and can we hold them? Should we hold them accountable? And is the court able to stop corruption? Is this a legal issue? Can this be done through the court?
There's so yes and no. Let's say short term, and I really want to hear Roger, as some of you know, is not not just an incredible political theorist, but also a deep legal thinker who's thought a lot about the court and the various American institutions. So I'm really curious about your thoughts here. The Supreme Court could play an essential role in constraining corruption in two different ways. One is in those particular cases which come that address Trump corruption, like if there's an emoluments clause case, not saying it's a political question or beyond the capacity of the court, which some people think it might do. And the other is in restraining executive power. So to me, we talked, I share Lowy's, I don't think it's just Lowy, but I share that aspect of the diagnosis is that the absent Congress has allowed for this rot. That a vigilant Congress would have done so much over the last 40 years to constrain presidential power, and it has direct power to constrain agency corruption. I mean, it's not even that complicated. Agencies are only acting with with congressional authority. But the Supreme Court's repeated allowance of expansions of the unitary, what's called the unitary executive, or expanding presidential power, that leads to one, the more of a blank check for Trump himself to do things, and second, enormous amount of power for Trump to then buy loyalty. You know, we're back at a British question. Like one of the real problems we have right now is the fear of electeds and agencies of Trump and of his. In other words, he has amassed a power to control outside of the bounds of the presidency. And if he were just the presidency, as bad as it is, we'd be a lot less worried than his ability to control the Republicans in Congress. Makes it a totally different and far more climactic and dangerous moment. So constraining presidential power, appropriately constraining presidential power, is something the Supreme Court can do. Is the Supreme Court actually accountable? I think yes, but only in the most trivial sense, but always yes. You know, even monarchs respond to agitation of the public. And the Supreme Court even this Supreme Court, um, is reached by the howls of the people. Not always in the way you want. Sometimes there's Justice Kennedy famously got so irritated by people that he would sometimes go in the other direction. So it's not always a direct line, but they're not wholly isolated in a bubble. And I have come to be, it's a way in which, this is why I really want to hear what Roger thinks. I've come to be much more skeptical of Marbury versus Madison and of judicial supremacy. In other words, not whether there should be a Supreme Court, but whether that court should operate as it does in the United States, where it has the final interpretive say on the Constitution, versus the way an analogous court does in England, where the Parliament has the final say in the Constitution. In part, Roger, because I do think it has allowed for more and more delegation of power away from Congress.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about what you think about the court's role here.
I think so my view on this is that there are actually three parts of our federal government: the judiciary, executive, and legislative branches, and they all have to be jealous of their power, ambitious for power. If you're going to limit power, right? It's the old, there's one ring to control them all, but you need 7 rings, and you need to separate the 7 rings. And the other rings are not federal, they're the states. And I think the states have a huge role to play in fighting centralized power. That's why federalism, to me, is not a conservative issue. It's actually an issue of freedom. And if you believe in freedom and preserving freedom against centralized power, I think you have to be a federalist. And I know that for a long time, federalism has been a bad word in liberal circles, but I actually believe that any good liberal should be a federalist. I think that the judiciary can play a role in preventing concentration of power for a time. But in the end, in a battle between the judiciary and either the legislative or executive branches, the judiciary will lose. Over time, if it's against the executive branch, he'll just reappoint and appoint new judges, and they will lose. And if it's against the legislative branch, they can overturn decisions, they can pass amendments, they can defund things, and they will win. So I don't think the judiciary is a long-term solution to the problem. Unless we find a way to reinvigorate the executive branch, the legislative branch, as a legitimate check on the executive, I don't think there's a way to maintain our Republican form of government. And to me, the reinvigoration of Congress is, Zephyr and I were asked by the folks here to sort of give some hope or tell people what we think they should do. To my mind, we need a new energy in Congress. We need younger people. We need people who are willing to fight for legislative power and legislative authority, and for the separation of powers. And we need people who actually believe that a Republican system of government, of self-government and legislative rule is meaningful and important. And so until that happens, until we get young, energetic, good people running for Congress, and then willing to do what the president is doing, right? Willing to be corrupt in the name of legislative power to fight the corruption of the executive power. Until we get that, I don't think there's much hope.
Okay, so
go ahead.
So let's disagree. This is good because I agreed with you up to the last moment. I mean, I think one of the key problems in Congress to me is so clear. It starts in 1982. There's a deeper problem, but in 1982, you move from members of Congress spending at most a week or two a year fundraising to it becoming their primary job, right? And so when you look at the enervation of Congress, how dead it is, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that's not sort of separate from questions of corruption. It's because when I was running for Congress in the Hudson Valley, making 120 calls a day to the richest people in world history, the collective power of rich people's voices is to move towards big speeches and no action, right? It's moving away from action. I just resist the idea of saying that doing what Trump is doing and corrupting the power. It's the energetic use of the power you have. I do think the left in general has been uncomfortable with radical, fully owning the boundaries of its power. It's one of the reasons I love Lena Khan and the FTC is she took her power at the FTC and she used it. She blocked mergers. She brought new cases. She wasn't a sort of tentative approach, which frankly I think defined a lot of the Obama years in terms of agency power, as a timidity, like a legalism. And maybe this is what you're calling corruption, but as a legalism is an over focus on crossing every T, as opposed to saying we have the obligation to use our power.
That's what I meant. They have to be willing to stretch the rules in order to fight against an executive that's stretching the rules. That's what the founders meant by being ambitious for their power, not letting people take it away.
So since I'm talking to the head of the Arendt Center, I will say that the institution that is the most often forgotten is hyperlocal government. And I believe that Arendt said that the great constitutional error was not including the councils, the local, you probably have the quote at your fingertips, but
I mean, to incorporate what was emerged in New England as the New York, as the New England town hall meetings, but to give constitutional standing to some level of government below the state.
Yes.
And there's a very important case that I can't remember the name of it, as you may remember it. I assigned it in my constitution. I gave it as the final exam in my constitutional law class a couple of years ago. But two counties in Pennsylvania, Allegheny County and one other county, are arguing about who's going to take other over. And then the state of Pennsylvania comes in and decides another way. And it goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, well, the counties have no power in our form of government, only the state. So even though the people voted this way, the state can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
And the fact that there's no constitutional recognition of local government below a state level is, I think, a problem.
And so whether we're not going to reform that constitution at this moment, but we can reinfuse local government with power. And so to the person asking about the Supreme Court, I would just suggest that where you put your energy is where your energy will go. So infusing your energy on protesting the Supreme Court, fine. But the real direction of local energy to me, or of political energy, a lot of it should be hyper local. And there's a movement out there, maybe Roger and I will disagree on this one, we get another good disagreement going. There's a movement out there with some incoherent edges calling itself the abundance movement. And a core claim of abundance is that we need more vigorousness in our government, and therefore we need less local government, because they see local government as the block to action. And I think they've got it actually upside down, that a vital, vigorous, engaged citizenry will block things, but will also do things.
Yeah.
And so that we, instead of trying to stop they're focused on one aspect of localism, but you can't separate them out, which is the local veto, the fear of the local veto stopping national projects. It's a very Hamiltonian, I would say, effort, the abundance effort. And I I'm not describing it in the terms they would necessarily describe it, but it's pretty close. And I just think that we have come to accept a level of, thinned out local parties, uh, a lack of power at the local level. And it's a hard puzzle to unlock because there is so much power at the federal level, and the Supreme Court doesn't recognize local power. So how do I don't know. I don't know the process of getting from here to there, but I think that when I look towards a vibrant democratic future, it involves a highly engaged local government, not merely a highly engaged Congress. And I think it's an area we should be putting a lot more energy into. And in fact, one of the areas the Arendt Center is putting energy into, and I think you may have done programs with this group before on it.
So we have a program in democracy innovation, which is really geared towards what's called citizen assemblies or citizen juries, trying to use lottery and choosing people by lottery, so money's out of it, and you can bring in lawyers and janitors and and everyone else, and have them come together and debate and bring in evidence and bring in like a jury, and then make legislation. And a lot of towns and local governments, and even in some parts of the world, national governments are starting to use these citizen assemblies as ways to build citizen involvement and legitimacy for political decisions. And so
really exciting because I think we get so locked in to like just tiny variations on the current moment. So I think bringing citizen assemblies in different local ways, showing that it's possible, showing that we can have different ways of decision making. I want to address Rezvan's question. He has a question in the chat about the constitutional right to secrecy. And Rezvan, tell me if I understand this right. You said that the idea is that sunshine laws, which allow us to see all the votes, make elected officials basically it becomes a scorecard for lobbyists, as I understand it. So it's like, oh, they voted the wrong way, so we're going to spend billions of dollars trying to support a primary opponent, and we should allow more secrecy and privacy in the deliberative process. I hope I've got that question right, Rezwan. Is that and I have so many thoughts about this. I was the national director of the Sunlight Foundation in 2008, where we worked cross-party lines to push through earmark reform. And I am in a moment of great reflection now. So thank you for indulging my rethinking of things. But I do wonder whether one of the things that was lost in earmark reform is sort of the sausage made through compromise. You get this hospital and I get this bridge, allowing us to then see all those earmarks and call them into question actually did not achieve what it was intended to do and led to less of the kind of deliberative process that I think Rezvan is asking for. I think maybe a different way to reframe Rezwan's question is to say, how do we imagine the deliberative voting and decision-making process working in a way that is less likely to be corrupted and could also be active, right? Because these are two different things we want. We don't want it to be active in the service of just big money, right? That isn't itself. Innovation in the service of Wall Street hasn't always worked out well for us. Innovation in the service of providing better shoes might, or better bridges. And I think that New York State, which has very little transparency into the lawmaking process, has not worked out well. It's often seen as one of the most corrupt state governments, not just because of everybody who ends up in prison, although we have ample numbers, but because of the reputation of how money influences lawmaking. And it's an area where the absence of visibility into how lawmakers act is actually a real problem. On the other hand, you're right. There's a real problem with a kind of scorecard model. So I don't really have an answer here. I really appreciate the question. And I would want to, I want to think about it as say, what is the kind of deliberation we want to encourage? Thinking about it in a founder's kind of way. What are the kind of systems that reduce the likelihood of corruption, but also enable the kind of deliberation for action that we want? And I'm not sure that I would frame it in rights terms as much as in structural terms. And if I were to say something meta about corruption, it's that I think that it's often more of a structural issue than it is a individual violation or uh, it doesn't fit neatly in our rights framework, I guess, is a different way of
Zephyr,
putting it. What your thoughts?
you're advising the next presidential candidate.
Oh,
Do you make President Trump's corruption a central plank in the platform, or do you ignore it? Or how do you address it?
ah, wow. I think you make the corruption in the United States political system a central plank in your platform.
You go bipartisan corruption.
You do. And then that doesn't mean you get Trump off the hook at all. And I want to be very clear about that. Trump's corruption is at a different level. It's a different level. This partly because I hear who was it, Nancy, getting mad at us earlier. And understandably. But I also just think it denies political reality to deny that people are disgusted at the whole thing. So that both, I think being honest about the extremity of Trump is important, and being honest about the overall rot in our system. Because I think if you just go after Trump's corruption, you're going to do a rerun of 2024. I mean, what would you do?
I have to say, I think your answer is spot on. I think the candidates that I'm finding resonating right now are the ones, many of them former military, people like Pat Ryan and Alyssa Slotkin and this guy, it's Terry Vance in Texas, who's running for Senate down there, astronaut, military guy, who are basically banging the drums that the system is corrupt and we need to bring back honor and dignity and patriotism and a sense of value for the republic. And though I think you're spot on. I think that's what I would do, and I think it's been what I think has been shocking is how much the attack on Trump's corruption as its own has failed as a political tactic. It just doesn't work. And I know Nancy was upset with us saying that, but I think we have to take seriously why it's not working. And I think your answer did that. So I agree.
And I just want to call out Pat in particular, because when Pat calls out Trump, he doesn't pull
Pat Ryan.
when he calls out Trump, he doesn't pull out any punches at all about how he is dishonoring and betraying the country. And he does that with a lot of credibility because he is not uncomfortable calling out corruption across the board and in the Democratic Party, and centralization of power, which happens both in the presidency, but also the enormous centralization of power people see happening in the private sphere, which then has become a quasi-public sphere because it's so powerful. And Ryan has made that. I have in the last several years been focused a lot on anti-monopoly work, and the framers would certainly understand this, but that anti-monopoly work as a democratic work it's protecting decentralized power, because centralized power necessarily leads to corruption, both indirect, where you pay a lawmaker, and direct, where you have these entities that are essentially operating like the public, but they're doing it in self-serving ways. So
now this will be, I think, my last question. Now you're not an advisor to the president. You're advising the people watching us talking today, citizens around the country. What do you do? What does a citizen do if they're worried about this rot of the system and the sort of blatant hypocrisy of the current administration and blatant corruption of the current administration?
Yeah. Well, Well, it sounds pat, but it's not it's not pat at all, is that you take collective action. So it's important that it be action, and action does not include Twitter. That doesn't mean that a Twitter strategy might not come out of action. You know, if you're overall, say, focused on stopping the Constitution pipeline in the Hudson Valley, whatever, take your pick. But that the core, it doesn't start and end with the short-term daily hit where you get likes or dislikes, and maybe even lawmakers like you. But if there's a way in which there's a real unreality to a lot of politics that I think then makes it not count as action. And I say this as somebody who's guilty of this. It's not easy. It is very easy to feel the swell of political action and the simulacrum of political action by being online.
Yep.
And the second is that the action be collective. That the act of taking collective action, coming together with others and negotiating what shall we do, how shall we do it, what shall we do, is still in human history a radical democratic act. And for all the challenges we have right now, we still have that right and a tradition of local power. It's a very enervated, thinned out tradition right now. But in New York City, I think trans alternatives, the Transportation Alternatives Group that has worked, sorry, I was talking not about gender, but about bicycles. The Transportation Alternatives Group has just worked for years and changed the shape of the city and shown what local collective action looks like. And I'm not saying you have to agree with bikes on the street, although you should. They're amazing. but it's an incredible example. And then in that action, in taking collective action, this is that democratic action, I really believe, is a muscle. You then learn. You don't know how you will. You actually need to go through it to learn. You can't read it out. It's about learning how to have confrontational conversations that lead to decision making. So I think taking collective action and taking collective action in ways that preserve our democracy are especially important. So taking collective action to revive citizen assemblies is one possible outlet. But or working on public financing of elections in those arenas. These are particularly exciting areas, but they're not the only areas. I really do think that those are important. And then put aside some time to collectively dream about what we could be. That the act of collective imagination is something that both social media and centralized power takes away from us. And reclaiming the act of collective imagining, to me, is absolutely essential. And it's hard to show where it will move. But Roger's heard me say this before, but the people that constantly inspire me are the people in the 1890s who kept dreaming of more democratic systems. Because as bad as we have it now, in the 1890s, Black Americans were not just denied the franchise, in fact, if not in law, but terrorized for trying to exercise speech rights and the franchise. Women didn't have the vote, and a few corporations ruled the day. And they did not stop collective dreaming. And those collective dreams took years to be achieved. But if they hadn't been dreaming and working in the 1890s, the law against money in politics in 1908 wouldn't have passed, or the one in 1912, let alone 1968, 1965 Voting Rights Act. So sort of understanding the importance of not giving up that power to imagine other futures. But Roger, I want to, I know we're near time, but what would you have people do? As you work with, experiments in democracy, what's advice that you would give people?
Well, I think we share a fundamental idea that democracy is a muscle. And I think that muscle is atrophied. We've given up too much power to bureaucrats, civic servants, administrative agencies, governments of all types. And I think that it's important to engage in collective action, as you said. And I think there's all sorts of collective action. There's being in an interest group, right? You could the Transportation Alliance. You can collectively act for the environment. But I also think that it's important to engage collectively beyond interest groups.
Yeah.
With people who are different from you and who disagree with
really
you.
important. Yeah.
And one of the reasons I like town hall meetings or citizens assemblies or these kinds of things is that it puts you in a room with people who may have very different life experiences and opinions about the world than you do. And that's when you have to listen to them and they have to listen to you and you have to figure out what a common sense opinion is. And to me, the muscle of democracy is both advocacy and jealous advocacy for an interest, but is also learning how to think from the perspective of others. What Immanuel Kant called the erweiterte Denkart, the enlarged thinking, and Hannah Arendt made this the center of her idea of political judgment. You have to learn to be able to listen to as many different perspectives as you can, and then try and articulate what you think a new publicly acceptable common sense would be. And so I think it is important that people collectively act, but that we be willing to engage and act with people who really are fundamentally different from ourselves.
Oh, I really love that. And I maybe I'll just put a finer point on what I was saying earlier. If you are collectively acting effectively, not just for fun, and a lot of things that look miserable are kind of forms of entertainment. I think there's a lot of like faux political activity that's just entertainment. You will necessarily engage with people who disagree with you. And I would say that, right, if you look at different forms of environmental activism, that environmental activism that actively engages with those who deeply disagree is both the more effective, but also far more democratic, as opposed to that which is dismissive of, of the other. And you're so right that that it's enervated, it's become scary, I think, for people. There's a lot of language that suggests that conversation with those with whom you deeply morally disagree, it's not framed as that, is platforming toxic views. I'm just sort of using these two different ways of talking. And I would say, just remember that conversation with those with who you deeply morally disagree is absolutely essential for democracy. Without it, there's just vote counting, polling, but it's not real self-government.
Thank you very much. I know Lana has come on
Yes. Thank you, Russ.
office but thank you, Zephyr. It's always amazing and I learned so much talking to you. So thank you very much.
Likewise. Thank you to all of us thank you to all of you for joining and for asking your questions and for giving a nice excuse for me to talk to one of my favorite people to talk to.
Exactly.
Yes, well, thank you to you both. It's been a great conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise with our audience, and we hope you'll come back again. To our audience, thank you for joining us tonight. Our next program is Thursday, September 18th for Doge, What is Happening? Algernon Austin, Jonathan Mayer, and Peter Coy will update us on Doge. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night. Thank you all.